Hi, and welcome to some of the first results of the Global Drug Survey 2014. It was an absolutely fantastic year. We had almost 80,000 people from around the world, and as you can see, really some stunning attendances from countries such as Germany, but we know with a fair old number from the UK, Australia, America and New Zealand, and a host of other countries where we've got some really good numbers. So we just wanted to take you through a couple of the key findings as they relate to alcohol. So I'm going to kind of present various pairs of slides. The first pair has got those countries over 1,500 people, and the second slide has got those 4 countries where our numbers were slightly smaller. Now, obviously, the people who take part in our surveys are not a random selection of people. This is a self-nominating group of people, and therefore they will probably have a higher interest in substances than the general population. And generally, we have a better educated group of people who participate in our surveys, and that's partly because people have got to be web literate. Now, the comparisons that we're going to provide have to have some caution taken when you start looking at the differences between countries. And that's because our samples did differ not only in size but in precise demographics. That is their age, gender, sexuality, their involvement in clubbing, for example. One of the things that we've done each year is that we've used something like the audit, which is the WHO Alcohol Use Disorders Identification Test, to start mapping the sorts of levels of problematic drinking in countries. And the nice thing about the audit questionnaire is pretty much standardized across the world. One of the interesting things about alcohol is because it's legal, it's also one of the few drugs where governments have got guidelines, and governments invest a lot of money telling people around the world what their country's guidelines are, so hopefully people take notice of them. So over the next few slides I'm just going to quickly show you what proportion of our sample from each country scored 20 or more on the audit. And a score of 20 or more on the audit basically means you should probably go and see a doctor because you might be dependent on alcohol. Before we do that, let's just see who actually knows their drinking guidelines. And as you can see, across the world, just under 50% of respondents to the survey didn't know their country's recommended drinking limits. I mean, some countries were stunningly impressive in their ignorance of their country's limits, with Germany ranking first with about 65%. Closely followed by Switzerland and the Netherlands. As I said, we've got some other countries with smaller numbers, and we've also got quite a few Spanish people who didn't know what their country's drinking recommendations were. I'll just mention here that, of course, you can see that a below average number of people in Ireland and Scotland know what their drinking limits are, but don't for a moment think that's going to affect people's sensible drinking patterns. Because if we start looking at what proportion of the people were dependent on alcohol, we can see that it actually has very little to do with awareness. So generally across most countries you're looking at somewhere in the region of 3 to 5% of the population being alcohol dependent, so scoring above 20 on the audit. Average across the board in that kind of 4% mark. Britain's particularly high with about 6.5%, but it's really the Belgians who are coming in with a stonking 7.5% of the respondents being considered possibly alcohol dependent. However, that's not half as impressive as the Republic of Ireland, where we've got above 10%. Keep your eye on Republic of Ireland and Scotland because they're going to feature in the next couple of slides. Because what's really interesting is if you ask people how do they think their drinking compares to other people. And so we asked people who scored 20 or more on the audit how they thought their drinking compared to other people. Now, of course, the truth is that their drinking is massively above average. They're generally going to be in the top 5% or 10% of their population. But as you can see, on average, 1 in 4 people who were basically dependent on alcohol thought their drinking was average or less than average. The most deluded drinkers were probably those in Denmark, the United Kingdom, with the New Zealand and Australians not far behind. In fact, once again, it's also Scotland and Ireland with very high levels of what we call normative misperception. And that means that people who are heavier drinkers tend to underestimate what they drink. Why do they do that? Well, they do that because it suits them. If you do something that basically places you at risk of harm, you look around to other people for solace, to convince yourself that you're probably not doing anything that harmful. And generally, the higher your audit score, the greater that normative misperception was. And that's one of the reasons that we've developed the drinks meter, because the drinks meter is one of the very few drinking tools in the world that actually allows you to compare your drinking to tens of thousands of people across the world. You can also now actually compare your drinking to other people in your country and also in your gender and age group. So if you're watching this presentation, you're thinking you've got a clue just how your drinking compares to other people and whether you've got a problem, why don't you go to www.drinksmeter.com or download the app from the app stores and see how you measure up. Knowing how you compare to people or whether you've got dependence is one question, but really the reason that guidelines exist is to provide some sort of information to people around whether or not their drinking's placing them at risk. So if you've got an audit score of 20 and you're basically dependent, you are placing yourself at high or extremely high risk of alcohol-related harm. But you can see from this slide that about 40% of people didn't think that at all. In fact, across the world, somewhere between 30 and 40% of people thought their drinking was associated with only some or no risk of harm. And of course, if you don't think your drinking's associated with a risk of harm, you won't bother reducing it. And Scotland and Ireland once again also featuring pretty highly on that drinking delusion scale. Now, of course, drinking's so prevalent in our society, and sometimes when you drink a lot you still feel it the next day, that we were also curious to how many people actually went to work with a hangover. So we asked people, had they ever turned up to work with a hangover, and if so, had they done it in the last 12 months? So you can see across the world, ever turning up with a hangover was really common, with over 60% of people reporting that they had. On average in the last year, you probably got around 35%. Which are the countries with the most people turning up with a hangover? Well, that's the United Kingdom, the Dutch, the Hungarians, with the Australians and the Belgians not far behind. It's not an exclusive, actually, property to anyone. And certainly we can see fairly high rates there for the Republic of Ireland and for Scotland as well. The Portuguese always seem to be pretty sensible, actually. People also sometimes turn up to work coming down after having used drugs. So we also asked for the first time whether or not people had gone to work coming down from drugs. And the levels, as you can see, were about half of that in terms of people coming down from alcohol. The worst offenders coming down in the last year, again with the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, with Germany not too far behind. That's really important because if you're doing a job that is operating machinery or in transport, coming down to work if you're still hungover or affected by drugs could possibly place you or other people at risk. And although Global Drug Survey accepts that what people do in their private life shouldn't be the business of employers, our interest is that we think employers might be in a position to promote health and well-being at work. And what we certainly don't want, and what I don't think any of us want, is someone who's driving our kids in a school bus going to work off their head or coming down after a big bender on a pill. I hope you enjoyed that quick look at alcohol. Topics that we're going to cover in this little series are drug prices and value for money across the world. We're also going to look at cannabis. We're also going to look at what proportion of people turn up to emergency treatment in a 12-month period in association with the really commonly used drugs, and what the level of exposure is to violence when people score. And the final thing we'll take a look at is internet drugs and research chemicals. I hope you enjoyed that. Any questions, please email me at adam@globaldrugsurvey.com.